Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your source material and really, plunge headfirst into a whole world of knowledge.
That's right.
So today we're kind of time traveling, right? Back
Yep.
to 1945. You've given us some fantastic stuff, including, I love that Mr. Hutchings History podcast episode.
That's a good one.
Yeah. It's all about the rise of the U.S. and the USSR as superpowers after World War II.
Yeah, and what a time, huh? It's like the world was getting a hard reset, and all the decisions that were made back then, they still have a ripple effect on global politics even today.
It's mind-blowing. So we're going to unpack, why these two nations just, shot to the top. We're talking military muscle, economic powerhouses,
Right.
and, of course, their big clashing ideologies. We can't forget about that, right? Plus, we'll break down those key events that really set the stage for the Cold War.
Yes.
But first, okay, I want you to just, close your eyes for a sec. Imagine 1945. What did the world even look like back then? Paint us a picture.
Okay, so picture this. Europe, which was once a global powerhouse, is in ruins.
Oh, wow.
Cities are devastated, industries are shattered, and traditional powers like, Great Britain, France,
Right.
they're shadows of their former selves.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like a completely different planet.
Oh, yeah.
So with these titans, Britain, France, down for the count, who steps into the ring?
That's where the U.S. and the USSR come in. They emerged from that conflict, World War II, relatively unscathed, at least in comparison.
Okay.
This created a power vacuum, a void just begging to be filled. And
Oh.
as we know, when there's a power grab, things can get a little
Oh, yeah.
tense.
Especially with two nations that are as ideologically opposed as, the U.S. and the USSR.
Totally.
But before we even get into that whole ideological showdown, let's talk about their militaries.
Okay.
The podcast highlighted how different their strengths were. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the U.S. had this incredible air power, right? And the sheer force that they demonstrated, culminating in the atomic bombs. Right?
Well, let's just say that was a game changer. Nobody could ignore that.
Yeah, it's chilling, really. It's chilling to think about, the implications of the atomic bomb, a terrifying new era.
Yeah.
But the podcast also mentioned that the Soviets had their own kind of, trump card, right?
Yes.
The Red Army.
Yes.
Wasn't their land force considered almost unstoppable at the time?
Almost is an understatement. The Red Army was absolutely instrumental in dismantling that Nazi war machine. They were a force to be reckoned with, especially in Europe, where their strategic positioning gave them a significant edge. They had, control on the ground, so to speak.
It's fascinating how those different military strengths played out on the world stage. But it wasn't all about military might, was it? The podcast also dives into, the economic engines that these superpowers had, revved up. Absolutely. Let's start with the U.S. They came out of the war, again, relatively unscathed industrially. In fact, their wartime production had kind of transformed them into this economic powerhouse. They were supplying the Allies with practically everything.
They were like the ultimate factory, just churning out supplies. It's almost hard to, comprehend the scale.
Yeah.
So how did they leverage that economic might?
Very strategically. A prime example is the Marshall Plan. Okay? Imagine a massive aid package aimed at rebuilding war-torn Europe.
Okay.
Not only did it help those devastated nations get back on their feet, but some argue it was also this really clever way to prevent the spread of communism.
See, that's fascinating. So some historians see the Marshall Plan as this strategic chess move, right? Using economic aid to influence global politics. It really makes you wonder about the motivations behind such grand gestures, doesn't it?
Indeed. And then you have the Soviet Union. Now, while they suffered massive losses during the war, they still controlled vast resources. Plus, their influence in Eastern Europe gave them access to even more.
So they were playing a different economic game. It's like leveraging their position and resources even without that same industrial output as the U.S.
Exactly. The Soviets went all in on a centralized, state-controlled economic model, think like communist bloc, right? With resources funneled toward rebuilding and solidifying their sphere of influence. And this, of course, stood in stark contrast to the capitalist system championed by the U.S.
Right.
And that's where the real heart of the Cold War lies, a clash of ideologies.
A battle of ideas, a global tug of war, right? On one hand, you have the U.S. waving the flag for, democracy and capitalism, the path to, prosperity and freedom.
Right.
And on the other, the USSR promoting communism as the answer to inequality. This fundamental difference in their worldviews, it set the stage for decades of tension and conflict. It's like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see who would blink first.
It really was like a global standoff, like a high-stakes poker game with the whole world hanging in the balance.
Yeah.
And the Mr. Hutchings episode, it does a great job, I think, of explaining how historians have kind of interpreted this whole ideological struggle. Because it wasn't as simple as just, like, picking a side, was it?
Not at all. The podcast mentioned different schools of thought, right?
Right, exactly.
Like some historians see it as this like epic battle of ideas, while others, they focus more on the like power dynamics, at play. It's like trying to solve a historical puzzle, but with like multiple missing pieces.
Yeah, totally. So you've got your orthodox view, right?
Okay.
Which kind of emerged during the Cold War itself.
Right.
They saw it as this, like, righteous battle against Soviet expansionism, a fight for freedom and democracy.
Yeah.
But then came the revisionists, and they challenged that whole narrative. They argued that the U.S., with all its economic and military, might,
Right.
They played a much more active role in, like, escalating those tensions.
It's so fascinating how, like, historical perspectives can shift so much over time.
Oh, for sure.
Like, what seems so black and white at one point becomes a lot more, nuanced as we learn more.
Totally. And there's actually another perspective the podcast highlights, and it's called the realist view.
Okay.
And historians like John Lewis Gaddis, they argue that at its core, the Cold War was all about power.
Okay.
Like raw geopolitical power.
Interesting.
It's less about like the nitty-gritty of communism versus capitalism, and more about these two superpowers just like vying for global dominance.
So from the realist perspective, it was almost inevitable that these two titans would clash.
Right.
Regardless of the ideologies. It's like that, what's that saying? Irresistible force meets immovable object.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
They see, in their view, the international system is like this giant chessboard, right?
Okay.
And the U.S. and the USSR are the ones playing this high-stakes game. Each move, each decision, it's about maximizing their influence and security, often at the expense of other nations.
Which is, kind of a sobering thought when you really think about it. This idea that, like, conflict between powerful nations is almost unavoidable.
It is.
But it also explains a lot about how events actually played out. You know what I mean?
It does. And then you've got the post-revisionist view, which tries to find, like, a middle ground.
Okay.
They acknowledge those power struggles, for sure. But they also emphasize the very real security concerns that both the U.S. and the USSR faced, especially after the devastation of World War II.
So it's not about, like, pointing fingers and saying one side was the bad guy.
No.
It's about, like, trying to understand the motivations, the anxieties, that really shape their actions.
Exactly. The post-revisionists argue that both sides were kind of operating from this place of fear and mistrust. They saw threats, sometimes where none existed, and they just reacted accordingly. This miscommunication, this miscalculation, that played a huge role, they argue, in fueling the Cold War.
It's like this, like, tragic case of global misunderstanding.
Yes.
Except with incredibly high stakes.
Right.
And speaking of high stakes, we can't forget about the, like, elephant in the room, or I don't know, should I say the mushroom cloud in the sky?
Right.
The atomic bomb. We talked about its development, but how did this terrifying new weapon, right?
Yeah.
How did it actually shape the dynamics of the Cold War?
Well, it's almost paradoxical, isn't it? On the one hand, the atomic bomb created this, like, atmosphere of existential dread, The world was holding its breath, aware that either superpower could just unleash unimaginable destruction.
Right.
But then at the same time, this terrifying weapon, in a way, also led to, like, a strange sort of stability.
Terrifying stability. That seems so counterintuitive. Like, how can something so destructive create stability?
It's the concept of mutually assured destruction.
Right.
Often shortened to MAD, which is,
Right.
pretty appropriate. Because both the U.S. and the USSR possessed these incredibly destructive weapons. They knew that a direct conflict could easily escalate into a full-blown nuclear holocaust, right? Destroying both nations and, let's be honest, probably the entire world in the process.
Yeah.
So
it's like they were stuck in this deadly standoff, right? Each with their finger hovering over the button, but knowing that pressing it meant game over for everyone.
basically, yeah. the sheer scale of nuclear destruction kind of forced a certain level of caution, like a terrifying stalemate.
Yeah.
They couldn't risk fighting each other directly without risking, global annihilation.
Right.
But that doesn't mean the competition stopped. Oh, no. Instead, it took a different form, a more, how should I say, insidious form with proxy wars.
Proxy wars. The podcast mentioned those, but I'd love to dig a bit deeper on that. What exactly are they, and how did they play into this whole Cold War dynamic?
Okay, so a proxy war is essentially a conflict where superpowers, like the US and USSR, they're supporting different sides, but they're fighting each other indirectly rather than, head on.
Okay.
It's like, imagine a high-stakes chess game, but instead of moving their own pieces, they're moving other countries or factions within those countries across the board.
So instead of directly engaging in what could be a world-ending nuclear conflict,
Right.
they're fueling these smaller conflicts in other parts of the world, turning them into these, ideological battlegrounds.
Precisely. Think Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. These became major proxy wars, where the US and the USSR backed opposing sides, each one vying for influence and trying to prevent the other from gaining an advantage. It was a way to fight for their ideologies, to fight for that global dominance, without resorting to a full-blown nuclear confrontation.
It's a chilling thought, really, when you think about it. All those lives lost, all that devastation, all because of this, global power struggle between the U.S. and the USSR.
It really is. It's a tragic reminder of just how complex these ideological conflicts can be and the devastating consequences they can have. And it highlights how even, the most well-intentioned policies like containment, which I think we should discuss in a bit,
Okay.
even those policies can have, these unforeseen and far-reaching impacts.
Containment. You're referring to that U.S. policy of trying to, contain the spread of communism.
I'll go with there.
Right, exactly. The podcast touched on it, but I'm curious, how did that idea of containment actually play out in the real world?
Well, imagine, drawing a line on a map and saying, communism shall not pass.
Okay.
That's essentially what the U.S. was aiming to do.
Wow.
The Truman Doctrine, which was announced in 1947, pledged U.S. support to any country that was, threatened by a communist expansion.
Good.
And it was a direct response to Soviet actions in Greece and Turkey, where communist forces were, gaining ground.
So it was like a defensive strategy, right?
Yeah.
This far and no further, we're drawing a line in the sand.
Precisely. The Truman Doctrine, along with the Marshall Plan we talked about earlier, these formed the backbone of U.S. foreign policy throughout this whole Cold War period. It was about containing communism, preventing its spread, and maintaining U.S. dominance on the world stage.
But containment, it wasn't just about economic aid and political promises, was it? Didn't it also lead to direct military intervention in some cases?
It did, yes. The Korean War, for example, that became a major testing ground for this whole idea of containment. When communist North Korea invaded U.S.-backed South Korea in 1950, the U.S. saw this as a direct challenge to their policy, and they intervened militarily. And it marked a significant escalation of the Cold War. It turned what was essentially a regional conflict into this, proxy war between the superpowers.
Wow. So even with this, looming threat of nuclear war hanging over everything, the U.S. still felt it had to act to draw that line in the sand.
In their view, yes. They truly believed that allowing communism to spread unchecked would embolden the Soviet Union, and ultimately it would threaten U.S. security. Of course, this whole strategy of containment, it wasn't without its critics, both then and now. Some argue that it led to, unnecessary conflicts, that it fueled instability, and ultimately that it prolonged the Cold War.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it, that even with, the best intentions, global politics it's messy.
Oh, yeah.
And actions often have unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And that's why I think it's so important, what we're doing, to examine these historical events from multiple perspectives, to understand, the motivations, the anxieties, the miscalculations even, that really shaped how history unfolded.
It feels like the podcast said at the end, understanding these different historical interpretations, it helps us appreciate just how complex the past really is. It's not about, simplifying things into good guys and bad guys. It's about trying to see the world through the eyes of those who actually lived through these really tumultuous times.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging, the nuances, the gray areas, the fact that even world leaders, with all the power that they have, they make decisions based on, incomplete information and their own perceptions of the world. And sometimes those perceptions are flawed.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it? This idea that history isn't some fixed narrative, but it's more like this ongoing conversation. Each generation is reinterpreting the past through the lens of their own experiences.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what makes studying history, I think, so fascinating and so relevant to our lives even today. It's not just about memorizing dates and names, you know? It's about grappling with these really complex questions, challenging our own assumptions, and ultimately developing this more nuanced understanding of the world around us.
So as we kind of emerge from this deep dive, right, into the rise of the U.S. and the USSR, what would you say are some key takeaways for our listeners? What can we learn from this really pivotal period in history?
I think if there's one thing to remember, it's that the world is rarely black and white. The Cold War, for all its complexities and tragedies, I think it reminds us that there are always multiple perspectives, multiple sides to every story. And understanding those nuances, that's essential if we want to even begin to navigate the challenges of our own time.
It's a lesson that feels, I don't know, more relevant than ever, don't you think? Especially in a world that's grappling with, new ideological battles, shifting power dynamics, and this, like, ever-present threat of global conflict, right? It feels very,
Oh, absolutely. Those echoes of the Cold War, they're still felt even today. And it reminds us that peace and stability, these are fragile things, and vigilance, diplomacy, a willingness to understand different viewpoints, those are essential for navigating this increasingly complex world that we live in.
it's a powerful reminder that the past isn't just something we study, it's something we carry with us.
Hmm.
It shapes our present and influences our future.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
It really is. A huge thank you to you for taking this deep dive with us today. Your insights have been, like, truly invaluable.
It's been my pleasure. It's always fun to delve into these fascinating chapters of history.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this journey into the past has sparked your curiosity and left you with some food for thought. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.